Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is someone who probably most viewers recognize, and viewers and listeners, and that is Dan Kaufman. But I'll ask him to introduce himself anyway. Dan, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Dan Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. I host the Sophia program on Meaning of Life TV, and I also publish an online magazine called The Electric Agora.
So thanks for coming on today, Dan. So we're going to be talking about a piece that you published at the Electric Agora a couple weeks ago. It's called Adolescent Politics. We will link to it below. What spurred you to want to write this and publish it on your site?
Well, we're now living in very heated political times. And I just find myself in so many of the conversations I get with people, not not caring about it as much as they do, and B, wondering a little bit about why they care so much about it. And so then I thought of doing something sort of like a personal meditation on my own sort of political journey, which has involved a lot of back and forth between left and right, to where I'm now settled into a kind of a center. But it's not so much because of an ideological centering as it is more kind of I would call political quietism. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of interested in why that was. So I wanted to sort of explore my own political disinterest to a certain extent. And I also thought that there probably was likely a generational aspect to it. And since you and I have talked about generational issues before with respect to politics and culture, that's why I approached you with it, thinking that you might be interested in it. And it also reminded me of a lot of things that Joan Didion had written that had resonated with me a lot, that also expressed a kind of ambivalence about politics. And so, but it really started off as a personal meditation inspired by the fact that I just keep finding myself having these conversations with people who are just incredibly politically hot, and not feeling it myself and sort of wondering why they feel it so much. I sort of tend to reserve that kind of emotional intensity really for my personal relationships, and not for issues, so to speak. I'm not saying that there are no issues I don't get sort of heated up about, but for the most part, I tend to reserve that kind of emotional intensity for the most part for personal issues. And the political issues, which I do tend to get emotionally very intense about, are ones that have a very personal resonance. So, you once moderated a dialogue I did on Israel and on politics swirling around that. Now, that's one that I will get kind of hot about, and it's entirely because I have such an intimate personal connection to it. And I thought that there was something to explore in that whole range of issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of a personal essay charting parts of your life's path. It includes, if people aren't convinced yet that they want to read it, it includes a photo of you from your Miami Vice days in your 20s.
No, that was when I was 16 years old.
Oh, okay.
That was in high school.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you were much more mature than I thought. Okay, so so you're wearing the Don Johnson kind of outfit, which is funny to see, and then talk about your time at college and afterward in graduate school, and then working as a professor. But weaving in the way that your milieu and other people around you kind of affected your politics, and you bring in Didion. It's interesting. I just thought of this now that in our previous conversation, you talked about how Generation X you felt was kind of spiritually connected to the silent generation, and she is one of the silent generation thinkers that still retains a lot of prominence. Whereas the millennial, which I am an older millennial, are kind of linked to the boomers, and sometimes it's just because these people are our parents, but also there seems like there's kind of a back and forth, like cycles of history thing where people's views sort of react to what's like the going too far from the previous generation, and then they like go too far themselves, and then the next generation comes around and reacts to it. But let's start with some terms. So you use the term wokeness. I think you use political correctness and if you don't, I kind of felt like you were talking about political correctness through some of it, and you bring up these kind of flashpoint cultural things that have happened over the last year or so, and the comedian Hannah Gadsby has this Netflix special that is like a weirdly like half comic stand-up, half performance art, spoken word monologue about, in which she kind of tries to like undermine like all of comedy whatsoever. And this was like a lot of people really like this, and to these more kind of weird things like the Gillette commercial recently, where it seemed to be criticizing, toxic masculinity or something, and this unusual statement by the actor Liam Neeson that on his recent press tour for his new action movie, where for some reason he said that he had once a friend of his was like assaulted or raped by a black man, and so he like was so angry that he was like prowling the streets looking for a random black man
with like a blackjack or something, I think he said.
Yeah, right? to assault himself and get revenge, and God knows why he decided to say this in public, but and people were up in arms about this. A very strange story to tell like a celebrity interviewer.
Well, didn't he say it in light? Wasn't he like? I think he was he was promoting a revenge flick.
Yeah, almost all of his movies are. Yeah, that's his genre.
So I think some people who were cynical about his motives thought that it was a ham-fisted effort to kind of promote the revenge flick that kind of backfired on him. That's very possible that it was cynical. In the essay, I kind of assumed that he was being legit. And I also mentioned the American Psychological Association's really weird guidelines that they released not too long ago about how to do psychotherapy for males, and I guess I just saw in all of it a kind of weird politicization of everything, in a way that I think strikes me as maybe characteristic of the times now, and maybe unusual, and also sort of representing maybe a reason why we should be a lot less political. Because one of the things I do argue in the essay is that a lot of our political instincts are essentially expressions of the adolescent id, so to speak, and that we're seeing it very clearly now in these sorts of performances, because they strike me, the word that people use is virtue signaling, which strikes me as kind of unspecific and not all that useful, but it really does look a lot to me like the kinds of performances that adolescents engage in when they're trying to affirm and strengthen the position within their clique. And it's done partly by sort of signaling to the clique, and it's also done partly by, dumping on and kicking the crap out of the people that are outside of the clique. And so I just sort of listed all those examples at the beginning as examples of what I thought were evidence that our politics was very sort of nakedly adolescent now, in a way that maybe before, maybe it always had been, but in before at least had been kind of sublimated. One of the things I started off with, notoriously Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill were obviously on completely opposite sides of the political spectrum. But it was notorious that they were able to get along in a civilized sort of way, and we can remember sort of examples of politicians like Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy, again very far on opposite sides of issues, being able to work together on legislation. It's almost impossible to imagine that kind of that kind of politics now, and that's also part of the. It's almost to me like politics used to be grown up, and now it's become adolescent. And maybe it was always adolescent, but at least people pretended to be grown-ups. And now it seems to me like they're not even pretending. But maybe that's just all confused. But that's what I was sort of thinking when I sort of was writing this. Mm-hmm. And I used my own personal story. I kind of admitted that my own politics is kind of adolescent, in that it's not really very committed. It's just sort of, if you go through my history, you'll sort of see my politics is really basically defined by whoever I couldn't stand at the moment, right?
Okay, so you have like a reactionary in like the dictionary sense of the term politics.
I guess so, yeah. But I guess I kind of think it's all like that now almost. And that maybe I'm just sort of saying, hey, we should just all admit this and maybe just step back a little. Huh?
Yeah, there's a lot here. So I think some of the examples you bring up, I think, are play out in different realms. So like the American Psychological Association's handbook or whatever, like this is important. It could affect real people's lives if their treatment changes in some way. This is something that's worth arguing about. I have like no idea what the proper answer to this sort of thing is, but like this is like a proper area of contestation. Some of the other things are more like, this would only blow up because we have the internet and social media. So like
which I also talk about.
Yes, you bring that up. That does seem to be one of the underlying like handful of factors that you can point to as like a hinge point. So Liam Neeson says something strange. If this had happened 20 years ago, maybe like an entertainment show would have reported it, but like they wouldn't have gotten a lot of feedback from people. They wouldn't have known that this activated people's anger and excitement, and so they would have moved on to like the next thing the next day. Because everyone can react instantly, everyone can chime in and say, Liam Neeson, what the fuck are you talking about? I don't know, like I don't think Liam Neeson got like canceled, like in the way some.
No, he seems to have survived this one. I can't tell exactly why. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just luck.
Yeah, I don't. Probably each case like depends on like strange circumstances. Did he have like a unknown history of being racist and like racist comments that weren't repeated previously? Like that'd be like the analog to the Harvey Weinstein thing, where suddenly, every woman who had experienced this was coming forward with a string of like habitual behaviors. So that didn't seem to happen. And then like, there's always something else 24 hours later, some new thing to grab people's attention. And I'm sure Liam Neeson has like a dozen more movies where he rescues his stepdaughter or whatever all those movies are about in him before he retires. And yeah, I think he was kind of generally seen as a like liked person, and he played Oscar Schindler. So all that helped him. And then so all these things get kind of like fought out in the world of social media, and I think that world also has a hard time distinguishing between what things are important and what things aren't important. Everything is, I mean, that's part of like the weirdness of Twitter, for instance, is that everything has to fit within 280 characters. Some things can include a video or an image or a link, but usually there's like a flatness to it. So someone saying that they, people don't usually tweet about their lunch that much anymore. That was like the original purpose of Twitter, was to tweet about what you were having for lunch. But something where they're like, oh, I just got home from work, I'm really tired. That's like right next to the thing that's saying like the worst, injustice in human history just happened. And it just like pushes everything to be on the same plane and makes it hard to.
I guess the use of the platform kind of switched. It was during like the Arab Spring and stuff in Iran, right? That's when people started seeing the non-superficial potential of the platform, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, the reason I'm not, you're absolutely right. I did not mean to suggest that all the examples that I listed were all sort of equal sort of significance or weight. It was more that I was trying to say that every sector of life has now been politicized in this way, and it has been politicized in a way that reveals how juvenile our political sort of dispositions are, is what I was sort of, in the Hannah Gadsby thing. I mean, I just, it wasn't just the Nanette itself. It wasn't just the idea that somehow the fact that there's injustice in the world is a reason why nobody should do comedy anymore, which is essentially what she was saying, as if there was an injustice 50 years ago when Richard Pryor was doing comedy, or when Lenny Bruce was doing comedy, when there was actually way more injustice than there is now. So that already is kind of juvenile and stupid, right? I mean, just on its face, but also just that. It wasn't just the Nanette thing itself, but then the sort of the misandrous rant that she went on at this awards thing that she was at, where she basically just sort of accused 150 million people whom she doesn't know of all being sort of misogynistic potential rapists. And I thought to myself, this is exactly how a 14-year-old thinks, right? I mean, this is exactly how a 14-year-old thinks and how a 14-year-old talks. And I couldn't imagine a comedian from earlier generations being that juvenile, right? I could imagine them being juvenile in a different way, right? Because certainly a lot of Eddie Murphy's humor is juvenile, but I couldn't imagine them being so unself-aware and sort of so juvenile in this kind of meta way. And I guess that and the Gillette ad, I just got this terrible image of just how teenagers behave, but now it's corporate CEOs and heads of major professional organizations and all of that. And that's sort of what struck me and started making me think, well, isn't that what everybody's politics is basically like? And maybe it's just that now it's all becoming sort of transparent. And I do think, and at least in the essay, I speculate that the reason it's becoming so transparent is what you said, and it's social media, right? I mean, it's the that in the sense I think I said in the essay that social media has turned every context into a high school cafeteria, and where everybody knows in every context that they are being watched by all of their peers, right? And so they're kind of performing all the time in a way that like you said in the past they wouldn't have had to, because the context they were in were not context in which everybody was watching them all the time. So.
Yeah, and just on the Gillette ad, I had a conversation after that came out with a guy who is a brand consultant, and we'll link to that below. But one of the
what consultant?
A brand consultant. He works as like an advertising agency.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. We talked about how was this disingenuous or not, et cetera, et cetera. But the original ad was a YouTube video that was like a minute long. Most if you watch TV, an ad is 30 seconds or 60 seconds. So I have no idea if the Gillette ad even ran on actual TV or if it was only online. So maybe they edited down a 30-second version.
It couldn't have run on TV given how long the full one is, right?
Exactly. So yeah, they couldn't have. So it would only run full on TV if like CNN aired it to talk about it immediately after. So and 20 years ago, if there was a commercial that was controversial in any way, you could talk about it with your friends. I guess like pre-social media, you could talk about it like on online message boards or chat rooms or something. But like, there's no way that a kind of like groundswell, at least an appearance of people arguing about it, would happen. And yeah, it probably would have like faded away like most things do. Although now in the now things fade away because there's always some new outrage the next day. And 20 years ago, it would just be like, well, normal life proceeds on, and the New York Times is not doing a story on this ad every single day. I'll have to check out that. I wasn't crazy about Nanette when I saw it. I thought it was the first half was funny. The second half was like this. I don't know. It just didn't work for me. So I haven't like followed the subsequent Hannah Gadsby stuff. But
so you didn't watch that award show where she spent 25 minutes berating men? No,
I haven't watched that. But as I recall, she was kind of like in Nanette. She was kind of like announcing her retirement in a way from comedy because it didn't work for her anymore, and was like suggesting like comedy must change. And then there was some think pieces, saying like Hannah Gadsby is right, comedy must change. But like comedy didn't change. The stand-ups are still performing all over the country every night, and comedy specials are still being recorded. So, it was one idiosyncratic person making this argument. It hasn't exactly...
It's a little more than one, though, don't you think? I mean, there is a lot, unless you think this is just way overblown, which fair enough, it might be. But there is a lot of no platforming of comics going on. There is one guy who was literally yanked off the stage at Columbia in the middle of his routine because he made some joke about black and gay people or something, and he himself is Indian or Pakistani or something. Mm-hmm. There is, at least from some quarters, a sort of push that comedy should change and that we should only have woke comedy now, right? I'm not saying that it's working, but there is at least a kind of a push from some quarters for that, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how it's working out. You see things, especially around like performing at on campuses. Like you could see why that would be more, something that would spark possibly more controversy than the standard performing in a club or an auditorium. And there's also the stuff about some of the people who had their past behavior brought to light because of the Me Too movement, Louis C.K. and the guy whose name just popped out of my head from Parks and Rec.
Aziz Ansari.
Yes, Aziz Ansari. They've kind of started quietly like working again, and it's kind of like, did they, have they learned anything? Does it matter if they've learned anything? Should they have a platform at all? These things I think are pretty complicated. Like, Louis C.K. will have a platform as long as venue owners think it's in their interest to book Louis C.K. because he'll sell tickets. And then maybe some people will protest outside Louis C.K. show, but the protesters will be dwarfed by the people in the audience.
Yeah, but don't you think? I guess we could do an entirely different show on comedy, but I always thought that comics were like supposed to be bad people. I almost thought of comedy as a way, as sort of one of the few ways that bad people can actually really be of use to everyone, right? You know what I'm saying? In other words, I guess I don't think it really matters what Louis C.K. did as long as he's a good comic, right? He's not a Boy Scout troop leader. What I mean? I guess, obviously if you do something criminal, you go to prison, right? And then you can't be a comic. I guess you could be a comic in prison, but I guess I just never quite understood why one had to be sort of morally upstanding to be able to be allowed to be a comic. Wasn't Richard Pryor like doing a bunch of cocaine and you know what I'm saying?
Didn't he famously? Didn't Pryor famously light himself on fire when he was freebasing cocaine?
Yeah,
so not a moral exemplar.
Yeah, I find that an odd standard, but I guess we probably shouldn't talk about comedy too long. But I didn't understand Hannah Gadsby's whole thing. I didn't understand the fact that there was tragedy in the world. That to me is the reason why you need comedy, right? As a matter of fact, the worse things are, the more you need it. It seems to me. And this idea, I don't know, this struck me as a kind of moral posturing that again struck me as how a 14-year-old acts. Not to keep coming back to the theme, but that really was the theme of my essay, was that really politics is simply us acting out our inner 14-year-old. And that in the past, maybe it's been masked because the spaces in which politics were exercised were adult spaces. But now, in a sense, we're turning all the adult spaces into adolescent spaces because of the social media is invaded all of them, right? And I don't know, with social media in the boardroom, I don't know how that's not, you know what I mean? And our president, his primary mode of communication is through social media. And so I guess the question is whether you agree that politics is inherently an expression of our adolescent ids, right? And that the reason that it's so much worse now is simply because social media has made it transparent, or whether you really do think there's a kind of principled politics that a lot of people, that people, at least in principle, could pursue.
I think most people don't know a lot about politics or think a lot about politics because they have a lot of other stuff going on in their lives, and maybe they follow the news vaguely, but they are not like looking at Twitter for political updates. So once if you're like looking at Twitter for political stuff, you're already like in, I don't know, the top 5 or 10% in terms of engagement, right. And you are not representative of the average American. I've referenced this piece many times on the show before, but Chris Hayes, before he was famous, wrote a piece about canvassing for John Kerry in 2004 among undecided voters, and it was about how his view of what Americans think about politics totally changed because people just didn't know anything. They held contradictory beliefs. I remember the one thing that stood out was that he just met a woman at the door who said, "There's no way I can vote for John Kerry because you can never trust the lawyer." So that was like her political position, was that you can't trust the lawyer, I'm going to vote for George W. Bush. So yeah, it's people have strange idiosyncratic beliefs, and most people don't participate in politics beyond voting or like scanning the headlines once in a while. So then you have like the super fans of politics who are fighting each other. So yeah, it is like, I agree there's definitely the adolescent aspect has been, social media either exposes it or encourages it, creates it. You have people people yelling at each other online in a way they wouldn't if they were face to face. You have people ganging up and tribalism, and social media encourages tribalism because it wants to show you things that get a lot of engagement, and the things that get the most engagement are things that make us angry. So it's taking human impulses that aren't very virtuous and reinforcing them for commercial gain. So that's bad, and hopefully we can figure out ways as a society to combat that. And it might be shutting down some of these social media networks or like the government taking them over because they're just like too damaging and too powerful for one company to control so much of our online lives. So I think there's a lot there. And then there is just the thing about the thought that never would have been immortalized if it weren't for the ability to do it on social media and someone saying something that they didn't really think about or saying, yes, I agree. 25 years ago, there would have been, you would have said it in your head or to your family members and that would have been it. So that makes it more like the space between what goes on in your head and what comes out of your mouth or your fingers type out has gotten even shorter. And so that's more like the adolescent id, the thing that we're supposed to, as we grow up, we're supposed to bury deeper and deeper. And is it just a coincidence or not that the president with the greatest adolescent id in human history is Donald Trump, our current president?
I think he's actually a perfect example. I mean, you asked me when we were chatting before we started why I didn't mention Trump, and I told you there was no reason premeditated. It's because I wrote the essay as a personal meditation, and I just really don't think about Trump very much. But if you ask me, I will tell you that I think Trump is sort of I think could be Exhibit A for what I'm talking about, in that I actually don't think Trump has any actual ideology at all. I don't think he actually really means any of it. He is completely an adolescent playing to his clique and doing so by, signaling to them constantly while at the same time kicking the shit out of the people who are outside of it. And for him, the whole world is a high school cafeteria. And I just think that that's so demonstrable by looking at him. I've never, ever seen the man say or do anything that struck me as even appearing to be principled. I guess what I'm just sort of wondering is this sort of, have I stumbled upon the true essence of political political activity, or whether this started at some points? I mean, one of the things in the essay that I do, that I use my own history for, because now I'm freaking old and my history now is 50 years. But, back in the mid 1980s, I talked about my experience of political activism at the University of Michigan. And I was actually surprised to find that it was well documented online, these shanty wars that I talk about. There were actually articles written about them. Apparently Jonathan Chait was at Michigan just a year or two after me. Or he was like a year or two behind me. And he has an article about this. And so just for people who obviously haven't read the essay yet, when I was in Michigan, it was the time when a lot of the anti-apartheid protests were happening. And so an anti-apartheid group decided to protest by building a model shanty in the middle of the school's quad. Now, once that happened, then a Palestinian group said, well, that's a good idea. So they built a shanty on the quad to protest Israel's occupation of the territories. Well, then a pro-Israel group said, well, if you're going to have a shanty, so they built a model of a blown up bus, right, to protest Palestinian. And within like a month, the quad looked like a fucking slum. Okay. I mean, it looked like a fucking slum. And this to me at the time just sort of reminded me, I was, like I say in the essay, I've had inklings all my life that politics was basically an expression of the adolescent id, because I sort of recognized it in myself. And this sort of reminded me of that. And what was so fascinating was I had not read the Chait piece before I started writing the essay. I found the Chait piece for writing it, and Chait essentially said exactly the same thing. What he said was, in the essay, he said, look, it's a shame that the activism that these students decided to engage in is clearly not an activism directed towards the issues that they're activisting about, but are entirely about social positioning within the university community. That's clearly what this was all about, one-upping each other. And so I felt sort of confirmed that, okay, well, this adolescent id theory at least goes back to the 1980s. Whether or not you could say it's forever, I don't know, partly because the whole idea of adolescence is really a property of the industrial era. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's a property of politics since the Second World War. Maybe it's a property of politics at least since the counterculture. I'm not sure. And I don't make an effort in the essay to make a really rigorous argument for it. Like I said, I try to illustrate it through a personal narrative. But I don't know if you have feelings or thoughts about this. About whether you think there really is such a thing as a principled politics still, or whether you think there never was, or you know what I mean. I'm not sure myself.
Yeah, it was interesting, and I didn't know about that the 1980s,
the Shanty Wars,
but there was at least something that was vaguely like that when I was in college, but I can't even remember what they were building their little thing for.
Where were you? You were at Yale, right?
Yeah, Yale. Yeah. So it's like, what can you do as an average person to like help some political cause you believe in, and also like where does the belief in your political cause come from? So, the like freedom riders in the 50s and 60s like would go down and put their like lives on the line and go like directly and trying to register
Freedom
voters.
Summer, students went down to Mississippi to register black people and got lynched, right?
Right.
That to me, I would say, okay, that's pretty principled activism, right?
Right. So then, okay, well, so that was like, an amazing moment in American like social history and effective protest tactic, and multiple people were murdered because of it. But a college student could just like take a bus or drive down to the South from the American North. You can't, in the 1980s, you had to take a plane or a boat to South Africa, as you do now as well, and that would be expensive and much more and disruptive to your life to take a couple weeks off. And what would you do once you're in South Africa? I mean, the protest movement was, as I understand it, since I was too young to experience it, was about divestment from like state-controlled South African industries, from like university endowments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there's like a link there.
Was part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like a link there, and then like the Palestinian students glommed on when the probably. What was probably less investment in Israeli, industries, although there may have been some. And then the Zionist students made their statement as well. So it just kind of became more and more like circus-like from something that started off having, they were basically making like a sit-in originally. And
I guess I don't see how building a shanty in the middle of the quad is going to make the university divest. I mean, if you ask me what the equivalent would be to something like what the Freedom Summer students would do, it would be something like spending your summer in D.C., doing free volunteering for organizations that are lobbying Congress and other. In other words, it just seemed like such an obvious sort of social jockeying sort of thing. I could be wrong about this. We're guessing motives, right? I mean, which is a difficult thing to do and probably not wise to do it too seriously. But I guess maybe what I want to say is I think an awful lot of politics is like this, and maybe more than we'd like to think. And I guess the two solutions then are either to try to make the politics better, which then gets to sort of trying to motivate people to act from their better natures, or just to have less politics. And I guess that I sort of err on the side of less politics, just politicizing everything less and really sort of saving it for the really big stuff. And I don't think we're going to improve the moral quality of Americans anytime soon. And if we could, we're heading in the opposite direction, it seems like. I would. So just keeping things level is probably hard enough without improving it. But I don't. It would be good if things were depoliticized, but I mean, part of it is the technological, the changes in technology in the past 25 years, and I can't remember. You mean the social media?
social media, YouTube, handheld cameras. I mean, I think at some point you wrote about that confrontation that took place at Yale between a student and the housemaster about Halloween costumes, which people will probably remember from a couple years ago. So if
the Christakises, I think their name was.
So if that had happened when I was at Yale, it would.
Oh, you were there when that happened?
No. That I was class of 2005, and this must have happened 2015, 2014. But I'm saying if this had happened when I was a student, maybe the Yale Daily News would have written about it the next day, but there wouldn't have been no video because no one had a camera in their pocket. So It would have just passed on. It was the video that went viral and enabled everyone to in the world to see it and sound off about it, and the conversation to go on and on and on. So now everyone has a video camera in their pocket and can, if they very easily learn how to upload something instantaneously. This is good in some ways. The Arab Spring showed that you could document government abuse very easily, but this stupid event with the Catholic school students and the Native American activists also showed that
none of that would have happened had people not.
Yeah, and nothing. I mostly ignore that story since it seems so stupid all through, but I don't think anything was learned or gained by anyone at all from that entire episode.
I agree with you.
So yeah, that couldn't have happened 15 years ago. So I don't know. You can't put that genie back in the box, I don't think, unless people really start to get sick of their phones and decide that they don't want to be carrying around these little potential surveillance devices. Where they are getting surveilled by the government and the phone company, and they can possibly take photos and video of other people.
So you think that the question of whether it's better to fight for better politics or for less politics, you think it doesn't even arise because we're kind of swimming in all this social media provided information, and that until that's no longer the case, there actually is no remedy, is what sounds to me like you're saying. It sounds to me like you're very pessimistic about.
Yeah, I guess I would be, and I'm going from material conditions and saying how are people going to react to them, and the technology exists and everyone has it, so what's going to happen? So maybe the technology has to change, or our views toward the technology has to change. I don't think we're all going to get better, and I don't know how we kind of make an effort to take politics out. I don't even know what concrete, people could just get off social media entirely. I don't know they're
and I don't even know. You mentioned earlier the idea of maybe that eventually social media will become a public utility. But I don't even see how does that help? You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? In other words, well, then the only thing that would help is if people didn't use it for that purpose.
Right. Well, at least you could imagine that, let's say the government took over Facebook, they would change the algorithm so that they no longer want you to use Facebook as much as possible, which is what Facebook wants you to do. I read an interesting little fact somewhere recently, which is the Facebook engineers realized that something. A piece of content that is very engaging for everyone is a photograph of your ex, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, looking happy. And people really spend a lot of time looking at that. So they changed the algorithm so that you're more likely to see a picture of your ex looking happy, so that you will look at it and they're more likely to serve you an ad. So that's because they're a for-profit company. So if the government takes over Facebook, which probably could never happen, then they could change it so it's not trying to manipulate you into just using it more and more and more.
Right. Although but that wouldn't select for not using it for political activity, right? I mean, that would just sort of decrease its use in general. But I think that the fact that what you said about not learning from Covington, not learning that these things keep happening. It sort of shocked me that the Jussie Smollett thing happened so soon after the Covington, and it was everybody just behaved exactly the same way again. And I think you're right that nobody's learned anything, and I almost wonder whether, what we're really discovering is that social media really has a much more profound and devastating impact than anybody really sort of realized. I mean, maybe it even is sort of magnifying the adolescent id and making it much, much harder to sublimate it in the ways that normally the entry into adult life would. I mean, that's part of what I tried to do in the essay. I said that, look, part of the way that you grow out of that you sublimate the adolescent is that you increasingly find yourself in adult spaces in which it cannot be exercised, right? But social media has made every space one in which it can be exercised. And, this gets back to something that I've always wondered, and that is why we sort of allow the unleashing of these technologies that can potentially have such a completely socially transforming effect without even having any sort of public conversation. I mean, they just appeared, and 5 minutes later, every 10-year-old had one, and now we're here. And I guess I don't know what else you could do. I mean, unless you sort of regulate every industry, but it really is. It's a bit terrifying, I think, and I think people really are underestimating it. Don't you? I mean,
yeah, and there's all sorts of crazy unintended consequences. Zuckerberg founded Facebook to look at hot girls essentially while he was at Harvard. The guys who founded Twitter, it was originally basically a way to text message other people publicly, and it wasn't the idea that creation 10 years later would greatly help Donald Trump become president is no one could have predicted. Very, very strange. Just on the Jussie Smollett thing. Which is another of these very, very stupid episodes in which everyone leaves dumber than they were before. I didn't know who this. I never heard of this guy before because I don't watch the show he's on.
Neither had I. I'd never heard of him either.
So yeah, he's a minor. He's not a super famous guy, and then when I kept on seeing his name, I was like, what happened here? And then I read the article of what he said happened to his alleged assault. I thought and then said to some people privately, there's no way this actually happened.
It was so implausible. I couldn't believe that anybody bought into it, and yet there was this whole stampede to defend him. But
here's the thing. I only said that privately. I did not say it on my Twitter, which has a very small platform, but enough that I felt that if I put this out there, people would take potshots at me, and I was like, I don't care enough about this to actually do anything. So the only people who, I'm sure there were some, from the beginning, there were some people who doubted him and were vociferous about it, but the people who got all the attention and likes and retweets were the ones who were gravest outrage of the millennium, and we have to stand up for Jussie, et cetera, et cetera. And now those people look foolish because if you weren't following the story, the thing turned out to be a total hoax that he.
But the reason you didn't tweet about it, think about it, right? The reason you didn't tweet about it was because you knew you were in your high school cafeteria, that your friends were watching, right? And that you knew what they would do. And the only people who were willing to tweet that were the other clique, who they would get kudos from their clique for dumping on it, right? And in other words, I mean, it's put all of us into this horrible, endless lunchtime, right?
Yeah, and it's not. Yeah, but that's true. But it's even worse because it's not only that my friends could have gone after me for it, my friends, my followers on Twitter, but also it'd be the kids at the other school across town who start going over against me, and the city high school, because it goes viral, and then people you've never heard of from all over the world are attacking you, and so that's a bad. Did
any of your circle publicly expressed out about it?
Yeah, I saw there were some people who I think one was Robbie Soave, who I've had on this show before. He's not exactly in my circle. He's a libertarian writer for Reason Magazine. I think he was early on the case, kind of doubting this. But I don't recall anyone being very early on being this sounds fishy or something like that. I think most people were it doesn't behoove me to to weigh in on this because it's probably a lose-lose. And if someone was right, if I had posted when I had my initial doubts 3 weeks ago, if I was I think this smells fishy, guys, and then it turns out I was right, it's not I really would get any benefit from that anyway.
Yeah, there was also no benefit from being right, being the first one to be right about it. Wouldn't have earned you anything, right? I mean, no, I agree with that. I agree with that. So what do you? So do you? You're pessimistic.
I guess so. I mean, I don't. Well, I'm a liberal.
Our politics is going to continue to be like this.
what I think will be interesting is as people who grew up with this technology, like become of voting age and start to enter politics themselves, like what will happen, like the way that the students at Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida started organizing after the mass shooting at their school. That gave me a sense of hope because, when I was, like school shootings kind of started around the time I was in middle school and high school, and like it never would have even, we would have never even considered that we could have been the ones who were like starting a anti-gun movement. Like we would have been like, that's for the adults to do. So the fact that the kids did it themselves and used their social media savvy is a heartening development. And yeah, I guess that's one thing to be optimistic about. But the social media companies continue to have the incentive to keep us angry and shouting at each other all the time. And government intervention could solve that, but probably, isn't going to happen during the Trump administration, and probably will never actually happen.
And it seems to me that they're in full out PR, nothing to see here sort of mode. I don't know if you watched any of or listened to any of the appearances that the CEO of Twitter did. He went on Joe Rogan. I think he was on Sam Harris. And they tried to push him on this, and he simply denied that Twitter is manipulative in this way, right? He simply denied, and he denied that there are no platforming people on ideological grounds. He denied that sort of, and I guess that just, I guess what I'd say is that we've given people a very, very mediocre character and questionable intelligence, other than in a very narrow area, tremendous control over public discourse. And I sort of don't know how we take it back at this point. It's sort of terrifying to me, at least.
Yeah, I haven't seen those, but I've seen other things that this guy Jack Dorsey, the head of Twitter, has done, and I see his tweets sometimes. He does not seem like a very intelligent person, and he kind of seems like he, is a mediocrity who lucked into this particular position and does not know how to either doesn't know what the changes are that need to be made to his platform, or doesn't want to make those changes for some strange reason. I guess
those hearings on Capitol Hill came to sort of naught also, right? They hauled these guys up, and it really didn't.
Yeah, I think they like Zuckerberg. It seems to me like a smarter person who kind of is strange and doesn't maybe understand human motivation in a lot of ways, even though he's created this way to manipulate what humans want. Maybe the most powerful single tool for human desire manipulation in human history. And I don't know. Facebook, like young people don't use Facebook anymore, really. I'm guessing your kids think Facebook is lame.
No, my daughter is 17. And it's basically just Instagram for her,
right?
But
I
have to say that she is very minimal in her social media, because she does not like the kind of toxic, infinite cafeteria kind of goings on, and so all she does is sort of post pictures. Basically all she does on it is like her friends' pictures.
Yeah.
She doesn't use it for socializing, any substantial socializing, because she sees how it is used for socializing, and the way it's kind of become the mean girl platform. So I'm very fortunate in that regard, because a lot of kids are being really damaged by the sort of bullying that goes on in these platforms. But no, she doesn't use Facebook. She doesn't use Twitter. That seems to be mostly adults using those platforms now.
Right, and I would guess Facebook would rank the oldest. There's grandparents who are on Facebook and know how to use it, and then like Twitter, Instagram, and then you get to like Snapchat and stuff, and newer ones. And I can't. I was briefly on Snapchat, but it was kind of impenetrable to me, so I stopped using it. I'm sure I'm too old for that.
Is that the one where you put stuff up and it disappears after a certain period of time?
Yes.
Yeah, she's dabbled on that also, but very, 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 very minorly, if that's the word.
Yeah, it's an interesting. You can see it as a reaction to the the idea that if you say something online, it exists forever, which kind of sucks when you really think about it. But the like user interface is kind of confounding for I don't know if you're older than 18 years old to figure out. Have you heard of this movie Eighth Grade that came out last year?
I thought it was magnificent.
Oh, okay,
I saw it. My wife, daughter, and I saw it.
Yeah, I just saw it on DVD last night.
Were you as impressed as I was?
Yeah, I really liked it a lot. It's pretty remarkable.
That girl should have won Best Actress. I mean, her performance is ridiculously good, I thought.
Yeah, so for anyone who hasn't heard of it, it's a independent film called Eighth Grade. That's about a 13 or 14-year-old girl in her last week of eighth grade, and she's always looking at her phone. She's very lonely. She doesn't have any friends.
She's got like a YouTube program, right, where she gives advice.
Right.
Yeah,
so she has a YouTube channel, giving other kids advice, even though she can't really follow it and no one watches. It's really good, and it captures a lot about how young people are living their lives through Instagram and Facebook. Okay, do you want to talk about Joan Didion for a second before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, sure, of course. No, I just I don't know that there's I used her to illustrate some of the central points that I made, and so I'm just going to read one of the quotes that I used. She says, this is what she says about sort of moralizing politics, which is what we've been talking about. She says, questions of straightforward power or survival politics, questions of quite indifferent public policy, questions of almost anything are all assigned factitious moral burdens. There's something facile going on, some self-indulgence at work. Of course, we'd all like to believe in something, like to assuage our private guilt in public causes, like to lose our tiresome selves, like to transform the white flag of defeated home into the brave white banner of battle away from home. And of course, it's all right to do that, but as long as we don't delude ourselves as to what we're doing and why. And in one of the other essays, she simply says that she always thought that politics, that her generation was called silent because they always thought that politics was really about trying to escape the personal. And that just really resonated with me. And I thought that I just saw a lot of what I was seeing was what she was describing. People, in a sense, using the political arena to express all of their personal longings and failures, to maybe win something where they've been losing something all this time, and that it was all a way of trying to escape their own personal private lives. And I guess that really resonated with me, and it was in discovering her. I rediscovered her not that long ago. Actually, once I was already working. I'd read some of her novels much earlier, but I rediscovered her essays much more recently, and that was what really finally kind of made me realize that I was on a political pendulum that really wasn't about the politics at all, that this back and forth from left to right that I probably did 2 or 3 times over the course of my life wasn't really about the politics at all. It was simply an expression of what my personal life was. And I just thought there was a lot of wisdom in that, and that was one of the motivations for the essay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've read. I guess I've just read 2 of her essay collections. I've read.
So Slouching Towards Bethlehem was the first.
I've read Slouching Towards Bethlehem and the White Album.
And then the White Album was the second.
Yeah. So are there other ones that you would recommend?
Yeah, she's got one that was written during the from the Reagan era through the Gingrich Clinton era, called Remembering Henry, which I would strongly recommend, and which also will disabuse anyone who wants to try and pretend that she's right wing, because she is as brutal to Reagan as she was to the hippies. I also really strongly recommend an essay that was published in the New York Times. And if you just Google this, you'll find it. It's available. A essay she wrote on the women's movement that permanently alienated her from second wave feminists who had been trying to adopt her because her novel Play It As It Lays. I don't know if you've read that novel.
No, I haven't read her
Her novel Play It As It Lays was widely viewed as a major feminist novel. And then she wrote this essay in the women's movement that really made the feminists very angry. And I think it was decades. I think the National Organization of Women like officially denounced her or whatever. But I always just viewed her as a fundamentally apolitical person, in a way that her companions in the new journalism were not, because she's one of the new journalists. Her, Tom Wolfe, Hunter S. Thompson, the others are all very clearly political, and I don't know, on a side, right? But Joan Didion, I don't think, is on a side. I think her side is that the personal should take priority over the political, and that the political too often is a sort of masked expression of the personal. I absolutely adore her. I did a dialogue with Bob about her, and I highly recommend her to everyone, both her novels and her essays.
Yeah, I enjoyed the ones I read, and especially I think I liked Slouching Towards Bethlehem more. But I mean, everyone's heard of that in the title essay. That is really famous. Yeah. Okay, double recommendation for Joan Didion's still with us. She must be like 89 or something.
She's very old, and I think Obama gave her like one of the most prestigious awards. As I can see in my head, she's a tiny little woman. She also suffered tremendous tragedy.
Right.
Both her husband and her daughter died pretty close to each other, and she wrote books about them that are very, very powerful books about bereavement. One's called, the most impressive one was called The Year of Magical Thinking, which I also highly recommend. The funny thing is, and I know that we're getting long, so this is the last thing I'll say. When you watch interviews, you will not be impressed if you watch interviews with her. She's actually remarkably inarticulate. But in my view, she is one of the best American stylists of the 20th century. Her writing is sublime. She can do more with less than anybody. And a person who was directly influenced by her and who voices it whenever he's asked was Bret Easton Ellis. Mm-hmm. Less Than Zero was very much patterned after Play As It Lays. And Didion appreciated the homage, and actually one of her collections is dedicated to Bret Easton Ellis. So, and more of that silent generation Gen X sort of connection, I guess.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything else, or should we? We're at about an hour, so maybe we should wrap it up.
I think we covered everything, and I appreciate getting to talk to you with you about it.
Thanks, Dan, for coming back on Culturally Determined as well. So Electric Agora is where the article is. The link will be below on the Blogging Aids website. And you are not on Twitter. Wisely, you are not on Twitter.
Well, Electric Agora is on Twitter.
Oh, okay.
Because that, I do promote my essays there. Electric Agora has a Facebook and a Twitter page, which basically I use simply to announce the latest publications. I don't use it for much more than that. I've been using Twitter a little bit more recently, but only with regard to things that I've published. I've been having a few conversations about the things that I've published with people, but for the most part, I have stayed away from it. What do you? I'm just curious. We don't usually do what's up and coming, but I think we should. I mean, what do you have? Do you have anything in the work? What are some of the culturally determined shows that are going to be coming? Actually,
the one I only have one other one booked, and it is with hopefully it happens. We're going to tape it next week. It's with the director of one of the Oscar-nominated documentary shorts.
Cool.
Called A Night at the Garden. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, sure.
So that his name is escaping me right now, but hopefully that will come together next week and probably be posted fairly soon. And that's all I have. I've been a little off my game and need to put more things on the schedule. But so what about you? Do you have anything coming up?
Well, I normally try to have several sort of piled up ahead, but personal things. My parents are very old, and my father actually is kind of ill, and so I've got to go back to New York next weekend, and so that's been kind of distracting. And so I don't really have something specific on deck right now. Massimo and I have a book that's coming out this year.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
on Penguin Random House. It's called "How to Live a Good Life." Massimo, me, and this other professor, philosopher, Sky Cleary, have this book coming out. And
this is the Australian.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Actually,
I remember that she was on the website. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a dialogue that Massimo did with her that I moderated as an invisible moderator.
Right.
So that's coming out, and that's really ramped up. For those who don't know how this goes, publishing with a major publisher is a learning experience. Let's just put it that way. In terms of the sheer amount, and I'm putting this in scare quotes because I don't mean to say it pejoratively, but of interference on the part of the editors. In other words, they will come back with an edit where basically the whole fucking thing is underlined, right? I mean, it just the rewrite process. It's nothing like academic publishing. In academic publishing, once you make the pitch and they sort of accept it, it goes through the sort of refereeing process. It pretty much, you write the thing and it pretty much goes out the way you do it. It's not like this. I mean, I would say safely that editors are essentially invisible authors on trade books. I mean, the amount of input, and you have to make. It's not like it's not a suggestion. Right? When the editor at Random House Penguin says, this, and this, and this, and this, those are all things you have to do. And I mean, maybe unless you're such a huge quantity that you can push back, but I'm certainly not. And I guess Massimo, who's more of a quantity, isn't quite yet. But yeah, it's been a learning experience. And those editors really are like invisible authors. And so that's also just been consuming a tremendous amount of time. And we're also doing hires. We're doing a hire at Missouri State right now. So I don't have anything on deck, but I will shortly.
Okay, cool.
I'm looking forward to yours. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. So what is the title of the book again?
It's called How to Live a Good Life, and then it's got a sub. We're still wrangling over the subtitle. They all want subtitles now. I don't know why exactly, but
pretty much every nonfiction book has a subtitle.
We're still wrangling over it, and the differences between the proposed ones are so minor that I can't understand how we're wrangling over them. But still, we are. So.
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll discuss that more on TV on your show.
Once it comes out, we'll do something on it. You know what I mean?
Okay, cool. So thanks, Dan. Thanks to our viewers and our listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks a lot, Aryeh.